Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping spent Thursday in private bilateral talks in South Africa as he readies for the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation Leaders Summit on Friday. He will be co-chairing the summit with South African President Jacob Zuma. Ahead of the meetings, he expressed confidence that they will yield fruitful results and write a new chapter of historic significance in China-Africa relations. Now, Sumitra Naidu is part of the team covering the historic summit. She joins us now from Johannesburg with the latest. And of course, Sumitra, great to have you on the show. Now, who else did the Chinese president meet on Thursday, and what other developments took place ahead of the Friday meeting with African leaders?
Very good evening to you, Uche. And as you say, historic indeed. Lots of excitement here on the ground. And yes, we do understand that the Chinese president held a few meetings with some African leaders on the sidelines. All of those closed meetings, so we're not really getting too much detail from that, so no real confirmation of who exactly he met with. But lots of discussions here going on, lots of preparations ahead of the FOCAC summit that's set to get underway tomorrow, and lots of analysis coming out. And you know, earlier today I attended a workshop that was held by the South African Institute for International Affairs, really discussing the relationship between China and South Africa, China and Africa, and the way forward. Let's take a look.
Resources will remain a key part of the story, but they'll become relatively less important over time, largely because China wants to become a less resource-intensive economy. It's shifting towards a domestic growth model.
A change that could be beneficial as China's middle class is growing and policy has shifted to a consumer-led economy.
There are companies that are interested in oil palm. Some have invested in rubber. There still is a demand for finished leather, raw leather, and semi-processed leather from Africa going into China.
Developing primary industries and the agricultural sector in particular have been identified as areas that will help Africa address unemployment and poverty.
Currently, people are poor because they don't have jobs. And if you want to create jobs, you need to go into to develop sectors which can be competitive.
But for Africa to create and develop new industries and take advantage of this opportunity, its own government policies are crucial.
If the African governments can install those smart protectionism, as some people would say, these trade measures, then that there is I think, way to go. But the market forces aren't conducive to it. It has to be government-led initiative with very significant investment in infrastructure, in human capital training.
China and Africa seem to have reached consensus that it's time to deepen its relationship and move it forward. And the 15th FOCAC summit about to get underway will be used to discuss just how this will be done and how Africa can benefit from further Chinese investment, increase development and tackle poverty.
Well, there you have it. As you can see, lots of discussion on the ground about how to move this relationship forward. Lots of talk about reindustrialization, lots of talk about investment in Africa. And you know, going forward, what is the plan really going forward? As we heard yesterday, 26 deals were signed between China and South Africa in the region, worth in the region of $6.5 to $7 billion. And of course, there may be more deals that are likely to be signed in the coming days. But just to find out what that all means for South Africa and for the rest of Africa, I'm now joined by Luke Simon Jordan, and he is an associate at the South African Institute for International Affairs. Thank you very much for joining me, Luke. Luke, you know, as I mentioned, 26 deals for South Africa, 94 billion rand. It's massive. But what does that actually mean on the ground?
Well, hi, Sumitra. I think it's important to remember that these deals are large in themselves and in absolute figures, but in relative terms, relative to the rest of the economy, they're not quite as large as they might first seem. So 96 billion rand spread over a couple of years will be less than 1% of GDP of South Africa's economy. So they help and they're important to get done, but they aren't going to transform the economy. That's going to require stronger institutions and policies and processes more than individual deals.
Of course, policy really, really important, and from
a lot of the analysis that we're getting is that it's not only Chinese policy, but African policy needs to be firmed up, so to say. African countries, different governments, they need to put the terms and conditions down if they want to make this work. Would you say that's a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, and I think what's as important as that, it really is the ball in that sense is in African countries' court. And it's about getting the policies right and also adjusting the processes by which they come up with those policies. So at the moment, a lot of the time the policies sort of arrive out of sort of central government or government policy in ways that don't lend themselves to being tweaked and adjusted and improved. Whereas if you look at, for example, how China engaged with foreign investments and foreign governments at the time, it was continually adjusting and improving its policies. So that sort of continual improvement in policy is going to be necessary if African countries are going to make the most of this relationship.
Have we seen a change though? This relationship has been really strong. It's been going on for a long time, the last 15 years. We're seeing the trade amount more than doubling over those 15 years, really strong. And of course, the reiteration of this commitment between the two countries. But where to from there? I mean, as you say about skills on the ground, I mean, you know, has that changed? Is China coming and skilling people as opposed to bringing skilled people here?
It is changing, and I think that's obvious to the naked eye if you're looking at sort of a Chinese construction project in Africa 10 years ago versus today, and just looking at the composition of labor force and looking at how they're operating and managing those. So in that sense, China itself has learned quickly and learned strongly about that it needs to skill African citizens and it needs to skill African workforces in order to be sustainable here. There should be much more done. Africa as a continent needs much greater investment in human capital, much greater investment in skills, and so in that sense, African economy, African countries and African governments should be making that ask and demanding more of that. In fact, probably more of that than of raw dollar figures or large infrastructure deals. That demand for skills really should be primary.
And that is the difference, as you say. We're looking for private capital. We're looking for foreign direct investment, domestic investment, as opposed to just the trade deals. Do you think that at the FOCAC summit, African leaders are going to actually push for that? And will China actually meet that demand?
Well, it's difficult to make a statement about African leaders as a whole. There are a very large number of them and we're a diverse continent. I do believe that some African leaders are doing that quite strongly. There are several African countries that really have put skills on the top of their agenda. Some others may do so less and may look more at the infrastructure deals and the sort of resources and the old way of doing these deals. But I do think there are several countries, the countries that tend to be at the forefront of industrialization anyway and building a manufacturing base anyway, are starting to put that demand right at the top of the list of their requests from China.
Now there's a lot of talk about reindustrialization. That seems to be the theme at this year's FOCAC summit. Africa tried it before and it didn't really work. They're attempting to do it again, and they're looking to China to assist in making this happen. Obviously they have the skills, they've got it right. Is that kind of relationship going to work, and will Africa get it right going forward?
Well, Africa can get it right and that relationship can work, but I think the focus of it needs to lie elsewhere than where it is at the moment. So at the moment, the idea is sort of African countries are trying to copy Chinese policies or instruments as they exist now. So sort of taking zones and industrial production zones, that seems to flavor of the month. And that's a little bit like the analog in government of importing shoes instead of machinery, right? What Africa needs to do is import the machinery, which is the institutions that allow industrialization to happen rather than these sort of one-off policies. And if African countries do that, and a couple of them are trying to do that, then I think industrialization does have a serious future, and that could work. But that's what went wrong last time, is African countries didn't build those institutions. And so, but if we do it right this time, I think there is a shot to do that.
Lots of lessons to be learned. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Luke Simon Jordan of the South African Institute for International Affairs. And of course, lots to be discussed over the next few days. As we said, reindustrialization, very big. Also, another big theme that's going to come through here is that one of African debt, the debt owing to China, and whether China will actually be a little bit more lenient going forward in terms of building this relationship, strengthening this relationship that it has with Africa. Well, that's all we have for you here, crossing live from Sandton. It's back to you.
Well, thanks so much for that update.